The desert does not forget. Long before there were fences, long before there were deeds and surveys and glass towers rising out of red dirt, there was water. Not the water you could see, the water beneath. The water that moved in silence through channels older than memory, waiting for the one season in 20 when the sky would open and the land would remember exactly where it used to flow. People forget. The desert does not. Out past the last paved road in a stretch of country where the horizon seems to breathe with heat, there is a place where the wind changes direction for no reason anyone can explain, where dry riverbeds cut through the land like old scars, healed over but never gone, where the birds, for reasons no one has ever written down, will not cross a certain ridge no matter the season. Ranchers who have lived here for generations know not to ask why. They only know to listen. This is a story about a man who listened for 60 years, and a man who didn't listen at all, until the desert made sure he had no choice. If you've ever watched someone ignore a warning they should have listened to, you're going to enjoy this story. Subscribe, like the video, and tell us where you're watching from. His name was Walt Bracken, and by the time this story begins, he had spent 61 years on the same 11,000 acres his grandfather had homesteaded. He was 78 years old, built lean and sun-cured, with hands that looked like the desert itself, cracked, weathered, permanent. Walt was not a scientist. He had no degree, no certifications, no letters after his name. What he had instead were 43 notebooks, stacked in a cedar cabinet in the back room of his ranch house, each one filled with decades of handwriting that recorded things most people would never think to write down. Rainfall, wind direction, the dates the migratory birds arrived and the dates they left, which washes ran after a storm and which stayed bone dry, where the ground felt different under his boots after a wet winter. He kept these records the way his father had, and his grandfather before that, not because anyone asked him to, because the land asked him to in its own quiet way, and Walt was the kind of man who answered when something asked. His neighbors, what few there were, spread out over the miles, called him the kind of man who just knew things. Walt didn't like that phrase. He always said the same thing back, "I don't know things, I just pay attention. Anybody can do it, most people don't." That spring, Walt noticed something. It started small. The javelinas that usually crossed through the eastern edge of his property, near the boundary line, had stopped coming. Not fewer of them, none of them. And the birds, the same doves that nested in the mesquite along that eastern edge every year without fail, had shifted their nests nearly half a mile west. Walt wrote it down. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he had learned across 6 decades that when animals change their patterns, they are answering a question long before humans even think to ask it. 300 miles away, in a glass office 40 floors above a city that never seemed to sleep, a man named Elliot Vance was looking at a map of that same stretch of desert, and he saw something entirely different. He saw opportunity. Elliot was 46, a self-made technology and infrastructure investor with a net worth that had crossed into 11 figures the year before. He was not a cruel man. He was not the kind of villain audiences love to hate. He was, in the plainest sense, a believer in progress, in scale, in the idea that vision plus capital plus the best engineers money could hire equaled inevitability. He had recently acquired 40,000 acres directly bordering Walt Bracken's ranch, with plans to build one of the largest privately funded solar and data infrastructure campuses in the country. It would bring jobs. It would bring power to a region that desperately needed it. In Elliot's mind, and in the minds of nearly everyone on his team, this was not a gamble. It was a certainty, backed by geological surveys, engineering consultants, and hydrology reports that had all come back clean. The land, according to every report Elliot had commissioned, was stable, dry, and ideal. Elliot had never met Walt Bracken, but he was about to. The two men's first conversation happened on a Tuesday morning on the dirt access road that ran along the property line. Elliot had come out personally, along with 2 members of his development team, to walk the boundary before groundbreaking. Walt was already there, leaning against his truck, waiting. Not because anyone had told him they were coming. He had simply seen the survey trucks the week before and understood what was coming next. "Morning," Walt said. "Morning," Elliot said, extending a hand. "Elliot Vance. I imagine you've seen the crews out here." I have. I wanted to come out myself and make sure there were no concerns from the neighboring properties. We take that seriously. Walt studied him for a long moment, not unfriendly, just measuring. You're building on the East Basin, Walt said. It wasn't a question. That's right. Our engineers identified it as the most stable section for the primary structures. Walt nodded slowly, looking out past Elliot's shoulder toward the flat stretch of desert beyond the ridge. That ground doesn't stay the way it looks, Walt said. Elliot smiled, the kind of patient smile a busy man gives when he believes he already has the answer. We've had 4 separate geological surveys. The data's very clear. Data's only as good as how long somebody's been watching, Walt said. I've been watching 60 years. That basin's been dry a long time. Don't mean it forgot how to not be dry. One of Elliot's team members, a young engineer named Priya Anand, glanced at Walt with real curiosity. Not dismissal, but the look of someone hearing an unfamiliar language and trying to catch a word she recognized. Mr. Bracken, Elliot said, still polite, still confident. I appreciate you taking the time to share your perspective. We'll certainly keep an eye on things as construction moves forward. Walt just nodded again. He wasn't offended. He hadn't expected to be believed. You do that, he said, and got back in his truck. He drove home knowing, with a quiet certainty that had nothing to do with pride, that they didn't understand what they were building on top of. Construction began 3 weeks later, and it was, by every visible measure, a triumph. Bulldozers reshaped the land. Concrete foundations rose out of the desert floor in perfect geometric grids. Solar arrays stretched toward the horizon, like silver wings catching the sun. Within 4 months, the first data processing structures were framed and roofed. Elliot flew in twice a month to walk the site, and every time, he came away more convinced that this would be the crown achievement of his career. Then the small things began. First, it was the sensors. A cluster of soil moisture monitors near the eastern edge of the basin began reporting readings that made no sense. Spikes of subsurface moisture in a place that had recorded 0 rainfall in 6 weeks. The site engineers assumed equipment malfunction and replaced the sensors. The new sensors reported the same thing. Then, it was the survey markers. 3 stakes along the eastern perimeter, driven deep into what should have been stable ground, were found leaning at odd angles after a night with no wind strong enough to explain it. The surveying crew reset them and moved on. Then, a drainage culvert, freshly poured, cracked along its base in a pattern the concrete contractor had never seen before. Not from settling, not from heat, but from something pushing up, faintly, from below. Individually, each of these was nothing. A rounding error, a fluke, the kind of thing large infrastructure projects absorb every week without a second thought. Priya Anand, the young engineer who had stood quietly beside Elliot that first morning at the fence line, found herself thinking about the old rancher more often than she expected to. She hadn't dismissed him the way the rest of the team had, not entirely. Something about the plain certainty in his voice had stayed with her, the way a half-remembered melody stays with you long after the song has ended. So, when the sensor anomalies kept recurring, she started keeping her own informal log. Nothing official, just a habit she'd picked up without quite admitting why. Dates, readings, weather. She noticed, the way Walt might have noticed, that the strange moisture spikes seemed to follow no obvious mechanical pattern, but they did seem to follow the calendar. Always a few days after the rare desert rains, never during dry stretches, always along that same eastern line. She brought it up once, carefully, in a team meeting. "I'm not saying there's a problem," she said. "I'm saying I don't understand it yet, and I don't love building on things I don't understand." Her supervisor thanked her for the diligence and moved the meeting along to the next agenda item. Nobody dismissed her. Nobody argued with her. They simply trusted the data they already had. The surveys, the consultants, the reports stacked in binders on every desk in the building. Over a pattern one junior engineer had noticed by paying closer attention than her job description required. But Walt noticed something else that same month. The ground near the boundary fence had begun to feel different under his boots after his morning walks. Softer in one narrow line, running almost exactly beneath where the new access road had been cut. He wrote it in his notebook. Then he did something he rarely did. He called the site office and asked to speak to someone about the drainage. No one called him back. The person who finally listened wasn't Elliot. It was Dr. Naomi Ferris, an independent hydrogeologist the insurance underwriters had brought in for a routine 6-month compliance review. Standard procedure for a project of this scale, nothing more. Naomi was not looking for problems. She had no reason to doubt the original surveys, which had been conducted by a respected firm and reviewed by 2 additional consultancies. Her job was simply to confirm what everyone already believed. But numbers, unlike people, don't care what they're supposed to say. While reviewing 6 months of sensor logs, Naomi noticed the same anomaly the site engineers had dismissed: recurring moisture spikes with no corresponding rainfall, occurring on an almost rhythmic cycle, always strongest along the same narrow line running northeast to southwest across the property. She pulled historical aerial photography from the U.S. Geological Survey archive. Nothing unusual jumped out in recent images, but in a set of black and white aerial photographs from 1957, decades before the ranch's current fence lines were even drawn, she noticed something: a faint sinuous line crossing the exact same path as the moisture anomalies. Barely visible. The kind of thing you'd only catch if you were looking for it. She cross-referenced it against old county water rights filings and found a mention buried in a 1961 land survey of a seasonal drainage feature, intermittent, historically active during high precipitation cycles. It had a name once, decades ago, before it was paved over and forgotten: Antelope Wash. Naomi drove out to the ranch the following week, not entirely sure what she was looking for, only sure that the person who might know was the old man everyone on site had mentioned, almost as an aside, as someone worth talking to. Walt met her on the porch and, without much ceremony, brought out one of his notebooks, the one from 13 years back, the last time the wash had run high enough to reach the property line. "There," he said, tapping a page filled with dates and water-level notes in careful, slanted handwriting. "Ran for 6 days straight that spring. Hadn't run before that in almost 14 years. Runs maybe once every 12, 15 years. Always same path. Ground remembers even when nobody's watching." Naomi looked at the historical channel data, then at Walt's handwritten log, then back at the moisture readings from the site. "This basin isn't dry," she said slowly. "It's dormant." Walt nodded like a man confirming something he'd already known for months. "Explains the javelinas too," he said. "And the doves. Moved their nests half a mile west this spring. First time in all my years watching them. Animals don't read reports. They just feel the ground shift under them before anybody else does." Naomi looked back at her own data, the moisture readings clustered along that same eastern line, and said nothing for a moment. It was, in its way, the simplest confirmation she'd found yet. "Desert's not empty just 'cause you can't see what's under it," Walt said. "Same as people, I suppose." But before the report reached Elliot's desk, the desert offered one more warning, the kind that almost nobody on site was paying enough attention to catch. It happened during a routine night shift check when a technician named Marcus Ojeda noticed something strange near the eastern perimeter. A section of access road, less than 4 months old, had developed a hairline crack running almost perfectly straight for nearly 80 feet. Not the branching spiderweb pattern you'd expect from heat expansion, but a single deliberate line, as if something beneath the surface had drawn it with a ruler. Marcus photographed it and flagged it in the maintenance log, the same as he had with a dozen smaller anomalies before. He didn't think much of it. Nobody did. Until Naomi, reviewing the maintenance archive as part of her report, pulled up his photo and matched the crack's path against the 1957 aerial image. It ran along the exact same line as Antelope Wash. She stared at it for a long time before she picked up the phone. "It's not random," she told her supervisor. "The ground isn't failing, it's remembering." That single photograph became the centerpiece of her report, proof, in a language even the most skeptical engineer couldn't argue with, that the earth beneath the campus had been trying to tell them something for months, in cracks and shifting stakes and sensors nobody trusted. Naomi's report went to the underwriters within the week. It went to Elliot 2 days after that. It described, in careful, measured scientific language, an ancient intermittent drainage channel running directly beneath the eastern basin, the same basin where 60% of the campus's core infrastructure now stood. It explained that the original geological surveys had been conducted during an unusually dry multi-year cycle, missing the periodic activation pattern entirely. It cited historical precipitation cycles, suggesting the wash was due, statistically, to reactivate within the next 2 to 5 years. A wet season away from turning that quiet, seemingly stable ground into a flowing channel again. Elliot read the report twice. Then he drove out to the ranch himself, alone this time. No development team, no engineers. He found Walt exactly where he usually was, on the porch, notebook open, watching the light change over the basin. Elliot didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked out at the land his company had spent 11 months and nearly $200 million reshaping. "You knew," Elliot finally said, not an accusation, just tired recognition. "I knew the ground had a memory," Walt said. "Didn't know exactly what you'd built on top of. Wasn't my business to know your plans. Just knew you were trusting the desert to behave, and deserts don't make promises like that." Elliot sat down on the porch step, uninvited. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel like the smartest person in the conversation. "We had 4 surveys," he said quietly. 4 separate firms, all clean. "They looked at 4 dry years," Walt said. "I looked at 60. Elliot let that settle. There was no anger in Walt's voice, no satisfaction. Just plain fact, delivered the way a man delivers the truth about weather, or gravity, or anything else that doesn't care whether you believe in it. "What do I do now?" Elliot asked. And there was something almost boyish in the question, something that had nothing to do with billions of dollars or infrastructure campuses. Walt closed his notebook. "You listen," he said. "Same thing you should have done the first time. What followed was not a lawsuit. It was not a scandal. It was, in the end, something quieter and more valuable than either." Elliot called a meeting with his full engineering team the following morning, and for the first time in the project's history, he opened it not with a directive, but with a question. "I want someone to explain to me," he said, "how 4 separate surveys missed something a man with a pencil and a notebook could see." Nobody had a clean answer. Priya, sitting near the back of the room, finally spoke up, describing the pattern she'd noticed months earlier, and the meeting where it had quietly gone nowhere. Elliot listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he simply nodded. "From now on," he said, "if someone on this team doesn't understand something, we stop and understand it. We don't build over the gap." The Eastern Basin infrastructure was redesigned over the following 4 months, relocating the most sensitive structures away from the historical channel path and incorporating a managed drainage corridor that would allow Antelope Wash to run freely when its season eventually came again, turning what could have been a catastrophic flood risk into a designed, protected feature of the property. The redesign cost time and money. It also, according to every engineer who reviewed it afterward, made the project safer, smarter, and more resilient than the original plan ever would have been. Walt shared his notebooks, not all 60 years of them, but the sections that mattered, the rainfall patterns and wash cycles, going back to his grandfather's earliest records. Naomi cross-referenced them against modern satellite hydrology models and found something remarkable. Walt's handwritten observations, gathered with nothing more than patience and a pencil, matched the scientific data almost perfectly, year for year, cycle for cycle. Priya spent an afternoon at the ranch house that spring, sitting at Walt's kitchen table, turning through pages of handwriting that stretched back further than she'd been alive. She asked him at one point why he'd kept records for 60 years when nobody had ever asked him to. "Wasn't for anybody," Walt said. "Land talks whether you're listening or not. Figured somebody ought to write down what it was saying, in case it mattered someday." "It mattered," Priya said. Walt just nodded, like a man who had always assumed it eventually would. 2 years later, during an unusually wet winter, Antelope Wash ran again, exactly on the path the 1957 photographs had shown, exactly as Walt's notebooks predicted it would, someday, without fail. The redesigned drainage corridor handled it without incident. Elliot visited the ranch one more time after that, during the dry season, when the wash had gone quiet again, and the desert had returned to its long, patient silence. He brought something with him, a framed copy of the updated site map, the one his engineers now used for every future project. Near the eastern basin, in small, clear lettering, it read, Bracken Drainage Corridor. Walt looked at it a long moment. Didn't need my name on anything, he said. I know, Elliot said. That's exactly why it's there. The two men stood together at the fence line where they'd first spoken, looking out over land that had, in the end, taught them both the same lesson from two entirely different directions. The wind moved across the basin the way it always had, the way it had moved for centuries, long before either of them, long before the ranch, long before the fence lines and the surveys and the silver arrays catching the sun. The desert had never needed anyone to believe it. It had simply waited, the way it always does, for someone willing to notice. And somewhere in a cedar cabinet in the back room of an old ranch house, a fresh notebook sat open on the desk, one more year of quiet observation about to begin. Proof of a truth neither man would ever forget. Sometimes the most valuable knowledge isn't found in reports, models, or boardrooms. Sometimes it's earned through decades of paying attention.